Have you ever seen a corpse that won't die for any reason you can find? That was the case that almost drove me crazy. That day, in the cold room of the morgue, everything pointed to this being a routine analysis, until I discovered that death is not always in the body, but in what is left unsaid, in the silence that weighs heavier than any vital sign. Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching this video from, so I can see how far it has reached. I am Dr. Ricardo Avila, a forensic pathologist in Lima, and I will tell you what happened when they brought in a young man with no apparent cause of death. The usual: no visible violence, no toxins in the blood, everything normal, nothing explaining why he stopped breathing. But his face, that unsettling calm, wouldn't leave me in peace. There was something there, in that heavy silence filling the cold room, something neither tests nor autopsies could reveal. That night started differently because everything seemed to be going well. The procedures, the tests, the protocol. But as it went on, I realized this was not a usual case. The strange thing was not in the body, but in what moved around it, in the context no one spoke of. A strange confidence, almost as if death had decided to remain silent and hide from me. It all began when I reviewed the blood and urine samples. Nothing abnormal. No traces of poison, drugs, signs of heart attack, or asphyxia. I examined every organ, every tissue, every cell. Every test told me the same thing. There was nothing. That's when I decided to look beyond the body, beyond the cold of the morgue. I had to understand what was happening outside, to explain what couldn't be seen inside. The body belonged to a man named Julio, about 30 years old, with no serious medical history. No detected problems. The family didn't understand what had happened, and neither did I, until the silence in the room became so heavy I had to pay attention, to listen to what wasn't being said. At that moment, I realized what was resisting me was not science, but the reality surrounding Julio. What I discovered later changed the way I see autopsies forever. The body showed an almost hypocritical calm, as if it were peaceful on the outside, but inside something had imploded. It wasn't a matter of chemistry or physical damage, but a trauma manifesting in invisible ways, a profound grief, a psychological weight that cannot be measured but that kills. Medically, it had no explanation, but the context explained everything. Julio had suffered a brutal loss, a blow to his soul that silenced his body. Extreme stress, undiagnosed depression, despair that can kill too, even if no one sees it in scientific tests. Death can be as cold and silent as that room. And right there, in that silence, I understood the importance of listening beyond the signs. From that day on, every autopsy for me carries that lesson. It's not enough to open and look. You have to understand what the body keeps silent. Science is essential, but the human context is the key that is often overlooked. Julio was the case that taught me not to trust only what is visible, because in death, sometimes the most important things are what cannot be explained. I remember that day perfectly. The city's humidity seemed to have seeped through the hospital cracks and condensed into invisible droplets inside the room. I adjusted my gown, felt a slight tremor in my hands that I attributed to accumulated fatigue, but also to that strange atmosphere I couldn't quite decipher. In front of me was a body, a person who just hours before had been alive, or at least that's what we all assumed. But the normality of his signs and results, that total absence of a visible or chemical cause to explain his death, began to sink into my mind with the weight of a mystery begging to be solved. Not out of duty, but because something inside me recognized that this was no ordinary case. I started with the routine, carefully examining every part of the body, taking additional samples, and revisiting the test again and again. But the data only confirmed the same. No poisons, no trauma, no signs of struggle. The organs were in optimal condition, the arteries without a hint of blockage, the blood clean and serene, as if the body had simply decided to stop without warning. I felt the silence of that cold room growing heavier with each passing minute, as if the very air held a truth that eluded me. It was then that I noticed the expression on the face, calmer than anyone could be after death. There was no fear or surprise, only a deep, almost disconcerting calmness, a countenance impossible to interpret on a body that should reflect the violence or drama of its own end. At that moment, I was struck by a sensation I had not experienced in my years working with corpses, the The feeling that someone or something invisible was trying to tell me something without uttering a word. Something not in the physical body, but outside of it, in that intangible space where life and death intertwine. I then decided to change my approach. I set aside the instruments and focused on reviewing the context. The deceased's last hours, his relationships, his movements, anything that could shed light on the coldness I felt in front of that scene. He had lived alone in a small, austere apartment in downtown Lima. There were no reports of visits, nor problems with neighbors or close family. He had worked as an accountant in a small company, a routine job that no one associated with risks that could precipitate his death. But something didn't add up. The phone calls I traced seemed normal, without concerning content, however. When I sifted through his text messages, I found a muted conversation, loaded with words that seemed to reflect deep emotional weariness. I then decided to meet his most recent friend, a co-worker who, with a trembling voice, confessed to me that he was going through a period of silent despair. He spoke little, appeared absent, but never shared his feelings or worries with anyone. That revelation began to shape the idea that perhaps the cause of his death did not reside in illness or accident, but in an invisible abandonment that had consumed his will to live, a silent and cruel process known yet little understood. Emotional death. I started delving into the concept, reviewing similar cases and consulting forensic psychologists. The literature spoke of situations in which the body responds to existential abandonment by slowly disconnecting, but how to prove it scientifically? How to demonstrate in a report that sometimes silence and the lack of internal struggle can be more lethal than any toxin or wound. Furthermore, the family had not even suspected that their loved one was suffering. No one had heard that silent scream hidden in his gaze. At night, memories of that unchanging expression returned to my mind. I felt a strange empathy, a mix of sadness and respect for how fragile and fleeting the boundary between life and death can be. Something inside me changed at that moment. I was no longer just a forensic examiner tasked with determining a physical cause. I was someone who had to learn to read those silences, to understand that behind a cold body, there could be a story that transcends the visible. The next day, I decided to inspect where he had lived. The small apartment was almost a reflection of his inner state. Minimalist, nearly empty, without personal belongings, with curtains drawn and an atmosphere permeated by palpable loneliness. On the table, I found a notebook with blank pages except for a few scattered phrases speaking of tiredness, a great desire for rest, and a desperate search for peace. Those writings, the product of a burdened mind, confirmed what I was beginning to sense. That body did not die from visible causes because it died in the shadows, in the internal struggle of the soul that surrendered to the weight of an invisible illness. I took the notebook to the apartment and shared it with a forensic psychological team I have collaborated with for years. Together, we discussed the possibility of considering this type of death not as accidents or traditional suicides, but as a state of prolonged emotional death. It was then that I realized how many lives could go unnoticed with this same condition, how many bodies could be on my table without the medical and legal system identifying their true origin. That understanding filled me with a mix of concern and professional awakening. In the following days, I lit an invisible candle, a silent alarm reminding me of the importance of looking beyond the body and its visible signs. I began sharing this experience with colleagues, promoting the need to investigate more deeply the psychological and social context in every case that seemed inexplicable. Beyond protocols, I had to listen to what was unsaid, what was trapped in the silence of a cold room. That death taught me that sometimes a human being's final act is not marked by a blow, a toxin, or a diagnosis, but by the absence of a plea for help, by the abandonment of hope that science must also learn to recognize. The body was ultimately buried without a determined cause, but for me, it was the beginning of a new mission. I understood that in my work as a forensic examiner, I had to strengthen a bridge between science and humanity, between concrete evidence and the complex story of those who once were alive. I set out to listen not only to the silences of the cold room, but to the silences of those who live surrounded by them, invisible to the world, but all too real in their impact. Sometimes I wonder if the true death we face is not that of the body, but the capacity to feel, to fight, and to ask for help. That case made me a different forensic examiner, more human and attentive, Someone who knows that the truth does not reside only in the autopsy, but in understanding the life that preceded that last breath. That cold room became a classroom, and its silence a song that still guides me. That is why, when I close my steps and begin an analysis, before looking at the results, I always try to listen to what is unspoken, because in those quiet spaces often lies the most powerful key of all cases. Weeks passed, and that case kept echoing in my mind with a persistence that surpassed any other I had handled. The more I investigated, the more I understood that his death did not fit into the usual categories. There were no clear signs of violence or traces of toxic substances, yet the body simply shut down. What held me back, however, was not just the absence of physical cause, but the silent conclusion of a will that had simply extinguished itself. But how could I prove it? How could I measure an internal collapse when the body offered no tangible evidence? I decided to return to hospital one night, after a tiring day, hoping that the cold might offer me some clue or at least accompany me in that search that had already taken the form of a ghost. I entered the cold room, the same one where the body had rested, and the atmosphere wrapped around me with that same intangible chill. This time, however, I felt I could hear the silence better. The usual hospital noise was replaced by a dense stillness that weighed almost like a presence. I sat in front of the cold metal table, took a deep breath, and began to date each stage of the case mentally, trying to unravel what eluded me. The first thing in my mind was his face, that calm expression, unsettling in someone who had recorded a dark but nonviolent end in his biography. Something inside me resisted admitting that this was just an emotional accident. I wanted more. I wanted to find a tangible clue, a visible sign, any microscopic anomaly. I took photographs of the corpse, printed them, and spread them over the table. The white light reflected a pale tone but seemed almost irrelevant compared to that serenity which, instead of unsettling me, named a different kind of silence, one that also seemed to invite me not to act hastily. I couldn't help but think of those last days his friend had described to me, in the words loaded with almost silent sadness, in the invisible wearing down of his spirit, but also in what no one had noticed, the vast web of absences that surrounded him. No one asked, no one offered presence, and that was like a shadow gradually burying this man's will. I then began to wonder, like a doctor exploring an unknown disease, what triggers hide behind an emotional death? Is social invisibility a lethal illness? Can a human being truly die of loneliness? I decided I had to know more deeply the home where he had taken refuge in his final moments. I had only entered briefly before, and I felt it was a fundamental step to understand the echo behind that lifeless skin. I returned to the apartment intending to look for anything that might have meaning, and although I tried to avoid cliches, it's hard not to be moved entering such a small space where the absence of objects and memories spoke more than words ever could. There was a tangible feeling of abandonment, an atmosphere soaked with mute echoes, as if someone had slammed all the windows shut to keep out both light and the sound of the world. I returned to that notebook on the table, the only piece of life amid the emptiness. The scattered sentences, written in shaky but clear handwriting, vibrated with contained and profound pain. I'm tired, so much that I don't know if it's worth going on. Silence has become my only companion. I want everything to pass, for this internal noise to stop. Each line was a silent scream, an attempt to communicate something that found no attentive ears. I wanted to share this finding with a small group of close colleagues, a team I trusted to debate the intangible, and in turn, to find a path in that shifting terrain where science and sensitivity seemed almost irreconcilable. The meetings were long, painful, and revealing. It was not easy to talk about emotional death in a setting that demands medical certainties, tests, and diagnoses. But I also understood that if we do not advance in recognizing these invisible ways of dying, we continue to allow many bodies to pass without being heard or understood, condemned to a death that the system cannot measure or prove. Forensic psychologists spoke about the erosion of identity, about the profound exhaustion that can cause a person, feeling trapped with no way out, to simply stop fighting, allowing life to leave their body without a visible physical cause. As I shared these debates with colleagues, I realized how my own prejudices were fading. For years, I believed my role was limited to identifying clear signs, but now I understood that I also had to become a bridge between the physical and the emotional, between the body and the personal story it holds or hides. I then recalled the fearful words of the deceased friend, who told me about his silences at the office, about that sadness that seemed to grow without anyone knowing how to reach it. All that made me think of how many other cases could be similar, deaths that escape detection because the medical legal system lacks the tools or willingness to look at that deep layer of the human experience. I then felt an urge to change my practice, to try to include a new approach that honored those absences. To do this, I developed an extra routine. In addition to standard tests, I began to gather information about support networks, emotional state, psychological, and social history. Not all institutions were willing to cooperate or recognize that reality, but we had to start, at least for my role. It was during that stage that something unexpected happened, a kind of twist that gave the case a new dimension. I received a call from a community organization that had been working with people at risk of social isolation and silent suicide. They told me about a program aimed at detecting cases of extreme loneliness and implicit abandonment, and offered me access to a full psychological profile they had developed of people going through similar circumstances. When reviewing that information, I found a series of patterns that matched surprisingly well with the case of that man. Hidden financial problems, untreated episodes of depression, progressive disconnection from social and family circles. All of this was a map of an internal shipwreck that the autopsy could not reflect, but whose impact was no less lethal. That unexpected connection opened a door I had not clearly envisioned before. Perhaps the mere fact that a death is not reflected in the body does not mean science should ignore it. It can be interpreted, documented, and addressed if you know where to look. I began to reflect on medical but also social education, on the need to train those in contact with life and death to learn to interpret these invisible signs so that they cease to be inexplicable cases and become stories the system can recognize and address. But it was not only a professional discovery. Internally, the case had left a deep mark affecting how I feel and see people. I realized how many times we pass unnoticed by each other, how everyday noise can drown out a scream that was never spoken. In the solitude of that cold room, I understood that forensic medicine is not simply a discipline of lifeless bodies, but a window to understand human fragility in its full dimension, an opportunity to make the invisible visible. However, the story still had one last twist that appeared when I least expected it. I received a letter months after the burial, sent anonymously to the hospital. In it, someone described having known the deceased and spoke of suffering even deeper than he himself could confess. The despair caused by the loss of a child years before, a sadness he never overcame and that slowly consumed him. That revelation added another layer to my understanding. Tangible proof that invisible wounds do not heal and that, in some cases, can be more deadly than any physical illness. That shook me and reinforced the conviction that my work should go beyond the simple identification of tangible causes of death. I had discovered that behind the silence of a cold room there could be a story of abandonment, silent pain, and an invisible struggle that also deserves to be heard and denounced. That letter made me think of all those who, without help, end up falling into that emotional abyss that consumes the will to live. It is not an easy fact to accept, but it is real, and for that reason it must be a priority for those of us who have the responsibility to give a voice to those who can no longer speak. Since then, I have not stopped telling this case, not as a mere closed file, but as an urgent call to all who work with life and death, so they learn to listen beyond the body, so they never underestimate the power of silences, and so they understand that sometimes the deepest truth is found in those dark corners where science is slow to enter, but where humanity cannot afford to ignore. Deep down, that case not only made me grow professionally, it also changed me as a person. It taught me that being a forensic specialist means having the sensitivity to discover stories that the eyes do not see, and that silence sometimes speaks more loudly than any scream. Every time I enter a cold room and observe a body without an apparent cause, I remember that impossible calm, that silent struggle, and I strive to be not just an examiner of corpses, but a guardian of those stories that death carries with it. Because in that persistent silence, sometimes, only sometimes, lies the deepest truth of every life that ever was, and that deserves to be heard, even if it is after the final breath. That letter opened a door I did not expect, but it changed my entire perspective. For days I reviewed every word, every phrase that described that deep and silent loss, that invisible wound that had accompanied the deceased for years. It was as if the death of his son had left an irreplaceable void, a black hole that kept growing, like a shadow spreading slowly until it invaded every corner of his existence. I then remembered the impossible calm expression he had when I saw him in the cold room, and I understood that this serenity masked such an old pain that it was no longer possible to scream it out, not even in life. I began to investigate that line, searching for connections to confirm or refute that hypothesis. I contacted the community organization that had given me access to those psychological profiles and asked for testimonies, similar stories with the same deep mark, that unexpressed pain. The responses I received revealed a brutal reality. Many people carry their grief in secret, receive no support or comfort, and little by little, unnoticed by anyone, that burden becomes unbearable. These deaths, slow and silent, remain off the usual radar, outside conventional statistics, but they are deaths nonetheless, real and devastating. For the first time in years, I began to feel that my work should not be limited to the traditional autopsy. I realized that I needed to get involved in a more human task, where the personal history, support networks, and individuals' mental health constituted a central point of my analysis. The corpse, for me, ceased to be simply a mechanical object of study and became the last sender of a message, a final opportunity to understand and perhaps to prevent in the future. I then decided that this case could not remain confined to a closed file. I organized an informal meeting with colleagues, forensic psychologists, social workers, and medical staff from various specialties. I wanted to open a space for dialogue to reflect on those difficult-to-classify deaths, which escape scientific frameworks but have a real, tangible impact on society. What happened in those sessions was revealing. A collective empathy was generated, a shared urgency to find new forms of intervention that included the invisible side of human pain. At times, I felt like I was navigating unknown waters without a compass or maps, only intuition emerging from the accumulation of small clues that seemed like scattered fragments of a jigsaw puzzle I was just beginning to assemble. But that uncertainty did not paralyze me. On the contrary, it encouraged me. I had found ground where my experience and my humanity could converge to create something different. I thought of that man in his last refuge of solitude, that domestic space that seemed to have been emptied little by absence, and I felt it was my responsibility to tell his story with all the depth it deserved. That image of the notebook, with its trembling words and half-goodbyes, became an emblem of those who, in silence, carry burdens so heavy they end up extinguishing themselves without anyone noticing the warning signs. It was a reminder of human fragility, and a call for health professionals, security forces, relatives, and the community in general to learn to pay attention to those silences that speak in codes we often ignore. As I continued these analyses, I encountered another unexpected turn. During a session with psychologists specialized in suicide and grief, I was told about a phenomenon they called emotional death, a slow and almost invisible process where the spirit collapses until will to live simply disappears. This capacity to let go, to gradually disconnect, was a concept I had only handled theoretically until then, but now I saw it reflected with complete rawness in the case before me. They told me how hopelessness and loneliness can act like a silent poison that corrodes from within in the absence of external signs. This led me to re-examine details I had previously overlooked. I reviewed medical reports prior to death, looked for patterns in correspondence, text messages, and conversations with close contacts. I then discovered that the victim had turned several times to psychological care services, but, for various reasons, never achieved continuity in those treatments. Constant interruptions, unequal access to care, lack of communication, and the stigma still hanging over mental health became evident as factors that quietly contributed to his deterioration. On one occasion, a neighbor even contacted me, having noticed a man's absence for weeks before he was found. She told me with a trembling voice how she had worried about him, but never dared to intervene out of fear or shame. She spoke about the apathy in his eyes, the muted voice, and his almost total withdrawal from the community. That conversation made me reflect on the role we all play in those invisible endings, how sometimes society is a silent and passive witness to those emotional disappearances, not knowing or not wanting to intervene. That silent complicity hurts as much as the loneliness that surrounds the case. Those testimonies broadened my understanding and brought me closer to a collective, almost shared pain. The more I listened, the more I realized that this case, seemingly unique, was the tip of a much larger iceberg, affecting hundreds, perhaps millions of people in similar situations, victims of social isolation and invisibility. It was a death that traditional science could not diagnose because its cause is not in the body, but in social non-recognition, lack of empathy, and absence of support networks. That is why I felt I had to do something beyond the laboratory and reports. I began collaborating with the community organization to develop programs to early detect signs of isolation and despair in vulnerable people. I visited community centers, gave talks, and also listened more than I spoke. I encountered heartbreaking stories, faces tired of fighting alone, wills slowly fading due to lack of support. These encounters showed me that, although the system may fail, humanity has an incredible capacity to rebuild itself when someone dares to reach out a hand. One night, as I was returning home, I passed in front of the apartment where the man had lived his last days. The window, now dark and silent, seemed almost like a mute scream calling me not to abandon that struggle. I reflected on everything I had learned, on how a death that seemed inexplicable had expanded my vision of pain and loss. I understood that I cannot separate my role as a forensic expert from my humanity. I cannot limit myself to recording data and processes. I must also dare to look into the soul, that intangible part that is often the key to understanding the true cause of death. From that moment on, every time I enter a cold room, I try to carry that lesson with me. Not all silences are absence, and behind apparent stillness lie deep stories that deserve to be heard. The cold table, the body without visible cause, the echo of a life that left without noise, have become a metaphor for my professional and personal commitment. I feel my responsibility is to give voice to those stories, because within them lies the core of our human condition. Fragility, pain, hope, and ultimately, the urgent need for connection. I have shared this experience with people from various fields, doctors, psychologists, social workers, and also with friends and colleagues outside the forensic world. The response has always been one of deep acknowledgement. It is necessary, urgent, to broaden our perspective so that those who scream from solitude and despair are not allowed to die in silence. The work I set out to do is neither simple nor comfortable, but it is necessary. I hold on to that conviction every day I cross the cold hospital entrance, and every time a body without apparent cause arrives in my hands. Because I know that behind that silence, behind that cold, there is a story that deserves to be read with care, respect, and empathy. A story that may be the key to preventing other lives from fading without being heard, without anyone noticing the echo left by their last breath. And so, in the silence of the cold room, I do not see just a body. I see an opportunity, an open door to a world where science and humanity can meet to save not just remains, but lives. So as I continue on my path, with each case and each silence, I keep that lesson as a beacon. Death is not always a visible end we expect, but complex, emotional, and invisible process that deserves our full attention. That the real challenge is not only finding a physical cause, but listening to the imperceptible cry of thousands who die in solitude, and ensuring their stories are not lost in the cold smoke of a silent room, but illuminate the way for those still fighting for a little warmth, a little presence, and a little hope. That night, I returned home with a mixture of feelings that I couldn't quite sort out. I sensed that something within me had changed, although I still didn't know exactly what or how. As the hours slipped by slowly, I felt an urgent need to review every detail of the case again, every fragment of information I had gathered. Like a puzzle that refuses to fit together, I kept seeing scattered pieces, subtle clues that, at first glance, seemed insignificant but probably concealed a deeper truth. It was that impossible calm, that knowing serenity, that tormented me. How can someone appear at peace when their entire world is collapsing from within? That question kept circling in my mind, insistent, like a shadow that refuses to leave. The next day, I returned to the cold room with renewed determination. This time, I didn't just review the usual analyses. I also practiced a different exercise. I tried to imagine the story behind the silence, the life that had slowly faded in that home. I put myself in the victim's shoes, tried to understand every invisible step that had led him there, beyond the physical, beyond what could be tangibly observed. I knew I couldn't blindly trust science without human sensitivity, and that story, the one hidden between lines and silences, had to be listened to carefully. As I analyzed images and reports again, I came across an old recording that was part of the file, a brief interview conducted by a community psychologist. In it, the victim's voice sounded muted, his words heavy with sadness that, although contained, shone brightly. He spoke of losses, empty offices, friends who disappeared. Certain prolonged silences caught my attention. Those pauses where it seemed someone was choking, trying to hold back tears they didn't want to let go. I couldn't help but feel a deep empathy, a lump in my throat that reminded me of the fragility we all carry. It was then that I decided to do something I had never tried before in my career. I contacted the closest family members directly. I wanted to better understand the internal dynamics, those little details that often only reveal themselves in direct, human conversations. The response, however, was more complicated than I expected. Some family members avoided talking. Others simply didn't respond. There was a sort of wall of silence and modesty that seemed to protect something both painful and shameful. Nevertheless, finally, a sister let me into her world and shared more with me than I had hoped. Talking with her was like opening a door that, although locked with invisible chains, yielded as soon as I demonstrated my intention was to understand, not judge. She told me how the man had changed with the death of his son years before, a change so gradual it was barely noticeable at first, like an invisible thread unraveling without remedy. She described how the sadness had turned into a dull silence, almost a surrender to life itself. His relationships with his partner and friends had cooled, leaving a palpable loneliness in spaces that once were warm and filled with company. There was no specific moment marking the break, just an accumulation of small absences, unanswered messages, calls not returned, missed appointments, until social disappearance was almost total. For her, it was a death in life, a kind of premature farewell that no medical test could capture. As I listened, I felt again that mixture of sadness and responsibility, that awareness that I was facing something much greater than a simple file. I understood that this family was not alone, that many others suffer from the same invisibility, and that even though the body fades, the pain remains latent like a shadow that can affect entire generations. The conversation with his sister was a turning point. I could no longer limit myself to my conventional role. I had to be a bridge between science and society, between cold data and human emotions so often ignored. With this new perspective, I resumed reviewing testimonies, documents, and records with a different approach, looking for patterns not only in medical information, but also in those minor details pointing to loneliness and despair. I found digital letters, incomplete messages speaking of fatigue, unexpressed feelings, an internal battle that never had space to manifest. There were fragments showing a silent plea for help, a cry smothered in the shadows of social indifference. The combination of these clues allowed me to build a much richer, more human narrative, showing how physical death was only the visible end of a much longer and more painful process. But just when it seemed I was understanding everything more clearly, an unexpected twist shook me deeply. While interviewing a social worker from the community organization, he mentioned a surprisingly similar case that had occurred months earlier in another neighborhood in Lima. The victim had a similar profile, a seemingly stable person who slowly faded into isolation until their body appeared with no apparent cause of death. The most unsettling thing was that, upon reviewing their backgrounds, I discovered both had been in contact and shared some close family members. It was as if this tragedy was not an isolated incident, but part of an invisible chain of pain and abandonment repeating across different families, like a dark echo crossing the city. I then decided to delve deeper into that connection, searching for any clue that could help better understand this phenomenon. I contacted specialists again, people close to both victims, and little by little, the plot grew even more complex. I discovered that these deaths were not only linked to personal factors, but also to a social fabric where precariousness, lack of support networks, and stigma around mental health played a decisive role. It was a sum of multiple intertwined factors, creating a devastating, silent, and systematic picture. This discovery led me to rethink how we view these cases within forensic medicine. How can we move forward if we keep focusing only on external signs while ignoring the signals society itself emits? How does our work change when we are not just report authors, but also active agents in prevention? I knew I had reached a professional crossroads that demanded a broader commitment, a comprehensive understanding considering the intersection of body, mind, and social environment. As I processed all this information, I couldn't help but feel a weight on my chest, that mix of sadness and frustration at a system that so often fails to catch these signals. However, I also felt a spark of hope because I found an unexplored path that could make a difference. I understood that forensics should not be limited to bodies, but could and should open up the dialogue with other disciplines, with the community, with untold stories. This reflection led me to another necessary but difficult step: sharing this vision with my colleagues, many of whom were skeptical at first. The invitation we organized to discuss these cases and their social context brought together professionals from different fields who, slowly, began to recognize the importance of going beyond the traditional method. The debates were intense and sometimes uncomfortable, but from them arose a fundamental consensus. These invisible deaths were an urgent call to rethink our approach, to humanize our work, and to build networks that would not allow those stories to fade away in solitude. Finally, I realized that beyond my role as a forensic specialist, I had to assume a community responsibility. It was not enough to discover the physical cause of death. We had to understand its roots, its connections to the social fabric, and act to repair what still could be saved. I returned to the streets, to the centers, to the people. I became a bridge that could bring science to community, and the community to science, hopeful that from that meeting something new and valuable might arise. That dark window of the apartment where the victim had lived kept calling me every time I passed by. I no longer felt fear or helplessness, but a renewed commitment. That window was now the door to a greater cause. The fight against the silence that slowly kills, against the loneliness that goes unseen, against the despair that consumes without warning. And though the path was long and the task complicated, I knew I was not alone. I had found allies who understood that behind every body there is a valuable story, and that, deep down, true science must also be an act of humanity. Thus, in the coldness of that room, I learned that not everything that matters can be measured or analyzed with instruments, that the absence of visible signs does not mean the absence of life or pain, that every case, no matter how silent it seems, is a cry that deserves to be heard, and that, in that balance between death and hope, between science and sensitivity, lies a true opportunity to heal, to prevent, and to transform. What began as an apparently inexplicable case had become a mission, a quest that transcended any protocol. It was the opportunity to shine a light on those dark corners where untold stories hide, to give voice to those who die in silence, so their whispers become urgent calls to action. And with that conviction, I moved forward, step by step, certain that although the cold room is a space of death, hope can also be born from its silence. As I delved deeper into this web of silences and absences, the feeling of facing something much vaster and elusive became persistent. It wasn't just one case, nor even two. It seemed like a pattern, a manifestation of a social malaise hiding beneath the surface of daily life in Lima. The idea haunted me as I reviewed everything again: faces, places, dates, conversations. It was an invisible map of pain expanding without a clear shape, a shadow crossing neighborhoods, families, and entire generations without anyone truly realizing or knowing how to act. One day, while reviewing a digital file, I received an unexpected message. It was from an anonymous person claiming to have crucial information about the cases I was investigating. Curiosity led me to arrange a meeting at a discreet cafe in downtown Lima. Upon arrival, the figure waiting did not seem willing to look me in the eyes. They spoke in a low and hesitant voice, as if carrying that truth was an unbearable burden. They told me stories of stigmas, family secrets, and a series of community networks operating in the shadows, trying to prevent tragedies but lacking resources and official visibility. Fear of reprisals and distrust in institutions made many people prefer to remain silent rather than seek help. The conversation opened a window to a parallel world, where human fragility faced an almost impenetrable wall of prejudices and barriers. As I listened, I felt the cold room took on another meaning. It was not just a physical place. It was a symbol of all those lonely spaces where life faded without testimony or outcry. At that moment, as the quiet words intertwined with the muffled noise of the cafe, I realized that my investigation, although forensic, also had to become a bridge to the social realm, to those invisible spaces where so much suffering remained trapped. From then on, my days filled with interviews, meetings, and long hours reviewing every detail with the new perspective I had gained. I spoke with mental health professionals, community activists, neighborhood leaders, and people who, like the victim, had lived on those borders of emotional abandonment. In each account, I found another fragment of the truth. The enormous difficulty in accessing support, the emotional precariousness silenced by an environment unprepared to listen, the guilt and stigma trapping the victims and those around them. There was an invisible thread connecting everything, a sort of unseen chain of isolation and pain. But with each step forward, I also felt the growing weight of responsibility. It was not only the duty of a forensic doctor to resolve the when and the how, but someone who now recognized the need to understand the why and what to do so those deaths would not happen again. The boundary between my scientific work and my human commitment became blurred, a line I had to cross if I wanted my work to have meaning beyond cold technique. One of the revelations that stayed with me was related to a medical document that, in my first review, had gone almost unnoticed. It was an incomplete psychological report, fragments of an evaluation conducted months before death. The professional who issued it noted clear indicators of deep depression, suicide risk, and significant social isolation. However, the most unsettling part was the footnote mentioning difficulties in intervention due to lack of resources and the patient's ambivalence toward the help offered. That small note condensed the whole tragedy. Official invisibility in a crisis case, the silent struggle of someone needing help but not finding or accepting it, and a system that often recognizes danger too late. Remembering this, I decided not to limit my final report to strictly forensic conclusions. I included explicit recommendations to improve coordination between institutions, to promote community support networks, and to implement protocols capable of identifying these cases in their early stages. I didn't want that death to end up as just another number in the statistics, but to become a call to change practices, perspectives, and processes. Because, as I had learned, the absence of visible signs does not mean absence of warning. Sometimes the signal lies in silence and the untold story. However, the path was not without obstacles. Some colleagues resisted this more human and social perspective of forensic medicine, considering it a deviation or an unnecessary burden. In meetings and seminars, I often felt I had to justify my stance to those preferring to cling to pure science, to rigid objectivity that quantifies and measures everything. But I was persistent. I shared every discovery, every testimony with respect and conviction, showing how this approach provided deeper understanding and could prevent other invisible deaths. Little by little, resistance gave way, and a space opened for a more comprehensive and effective dialogue. Meanwhile, I kept connecting with families and the community. I visited places like that apartment with a dark window, not with fear or helplessness, but with hope of finding signs of change. In those visits, I understood that prevention was also an active listening, daily empathy, and building networks where no one felt so alone. Because the real crack was not only in the lifeless bodies, but in the disconnection of people who, for various reasons, remain isolated in their own battles. It was during that phase that I came across the story of another victim, linked to the same family and social network. A man who, like the first, seemed to vanish without apparent reason, without a clear signal alerting anyone. The difference was that in his case, there was a personal diary revealing even more of those inner battles, descriptions of endless nights, feelings of emptiness, occasional glimmers of hope slowly dissipating under the weight of abandonment. This intimate testimony struck me deeply and confirmed the urgency of breaking the wall of silence, of opening those spaces where people could express their pain and receive support. Every element I added to my investigation brought me closer to a portrayal where death was only the last page of a long, dark book. In that story, loneliness was a silent protagonist, an invisible enemy consuming without weapons or wounds. The lack of networks, access to care, and understanding caused people to get lost in their own silence, until the end was inevitable. It was a painful but deeply human lesson to understand that forensic medicine could and should play an active role in prevention and community intervention. The last turn in this story came when, trying to contact more relatives, I was approached by a young woman who introduced herself as a mental health activist. She spoke to me about a pilot program aimed at identifying and accompanying people at risk of isolation and deep depression within vulnerable neighborhoods. The important thing was that she knew some names related to my cases and offered me access to records and testimonies from another angle. The possibility of cross-referencing this data filled me with hope. Finally, I could more concretely connect social intervention with forensic evidence. However, this collaboration also confronted me with an uncomfortable reality. Bureaucracy, lack of resources, misinformation, and prejudice remained huge barriers for these initiatives to have the necessary impact. It was a brutal reminder that the system, despite good intentions, was not prepared to meet these new demands nor fully recognize the complexity behind an apparently inexplicable death. I felt my fight was not only against the loneliness of the victims, but against an institutional framework that, consciously or unconsciously, allowed these stories to be lost in oblivion. Thus, as night fell over Lima, with the city lit but often inhospitable, I understood that the work was just beginning. It was not enough to identify, analyze, or report. We had to act, connect, sensitize. We had to create spaces where science and humanity meet without separation, where a cold body is not just an object of examination, but the reflection of a story deserving dignity and commitment. Back in the cold room, observing once more that body that had awakened this unease in me, I felt again the silent force that had previously baffled me. But now I understood that impossible calm was the end of a long and painful battle, the last cry for help that is rarely heard in time. My responsibility, beyond diagnosis, was now to be the voice breaking that silence, the bridge connecting science with life itself. What seemed like an isolated case had become a mission transcending the cold room and its frozen silence. It was a task of embracing human complexity in all its dimensions, of seeing death not only as a biological fact, but as a consequence of invisible social wounds. And although the struggle was long and the signs sometimes faint, I understood that in recognizing each story, in empathy and action, we could begin to illuminate those dark spaces, so that in them there would be not only death, but also the possibility of hope and transformation. In that tension between science and feeling, between cold and life, I knew my path was marked, not as an end, but as a beginning. Because sometimes, hearing the silence of the cold room means opening the door to a world where truth is no longer measured only in data, but in the dignity we give to each life, even those that fade away without noise. And it is in that commitment where the true strength of our humanity resides. As I progressed in this new stage, I understood that each piece of the puzzle brought me closer to the very heart of a problem much deeper and more widespread than I had imagined. That young activist became a crucial ally. Through her networks and programs, I was able to reach testimonies that had previously been inaccessible, voices trapped within invisible walls made of fear, shame, and distrust. Gradually, those stories began to outline a multidimensional picture. Not only lifeless bodies, but living people fighting every day with devastating emotional exhaustion, often alone and without real support. Interviews with families showed me repeated patterns. Denial, imposed silence, the feeling that openly talking about sadness or despair is taboo, a weakness that the culture in Lima still struggles to accept easily. I found mothers who cried in secret, children who hid their pain, siblings who blamed themselves without knowing whom to blame, and neighbors who, although sensing something was wrong, never took a step to intervene. It was a system of chained silences that distressed me and at the same time motivated me to seek answers beyond the laboratory and scientific tests. Diving into these experiences, I realized that the cold room, that space where bodies are analyzed rigorously, had transformed me into a symbol of something much greater. The place where the collective failure to identify and address those invisible wounds before it's too late is revealed. Depression, profound loneliness, the cultural stigma accompanying mental illnesses, and the lack of adequate resources formed a bleak panorama that clipped the wings of any attempt at early repair. It was not just a matter of public health, but of human dignity, of social justice. But not all was hopeless. Amid that web, I found small resistances, dim lights that refused to go out, community programs that, although scarce, worked with quiet passion to build bridges between those who suffered and those who could help. People who, vulnerable themselves, had become guardians of others' emotional well-being. Their struggle was invisible to many, but its impact was real, tangible in the testimonies of those who had managed to emerge from the abyss thanks to those supports. These stories gave me strength not to give up, to keep digging in what might seem like barren ground. It was arduous work that involved hours of dialogue with specialists, community leaders, and health professionals. In every meeting, I saw small cracks open in walls that seemed insurmountable, how the combination of forensic experience and social sensitivity could build much richer and more transformative knowledge. I proposed workshops, prevention strategies, protocols that integrated forensic medicine with community psychological services. We had to learn to read silent signs not only in lifeless bodies, but also in people who were still there, fighting under the weight of emotional and social abandonment. However, obstacles remained, sometimes stronger. Bureaucracy, budget limitations, and institutional resistance hit me like persistent waves. More than once, I felt my message got lost among papers and meetings that led nowhere. But the certainty that lives that could be saved slept within those stories kept me firm. In moments of doubt, I remembered the faces of the family members, their silent tears, their unanswered questions, and that gave me the drive to move forward. One night, when everything seemed overwhelming, I received an unexpected call. It was a man who said he had worked years ago with one of the victims and who, with some timidity, wanted to tell me something important. I accepted the meeting, and that conversation opened a new door. He spoke of a circle of people who, out of fear or misinformation, had not been able to share their experiences publicly. Similar stories, where deep sadness intertwined with fear and isolation, but also with missed opportunity for help. That confidence added urgency to reconfigure my approach. It was necessary to create safe spaces where these people could raise their voices without being judged or stigmatized. The sum of all these elements enriched my perception of the initial case and made me understand that I was not facing an anomaly, but a social phenomenon that demanded comprehensive attention. Every forensic detail, every anecdotal story, every silenced testimony interwove to form a mural where death was a tragic consequence, not a random outcome. Prevention then lay in early intervention, in education, in humanizing the system, in involving the community in a collective commitment to avoid more deadly silences. Meanwhile, visits to affected neighborhoods became an essential part of my work. I walked streets I had known since childhood, but now I saw them with new eyes, attentive to signals that had previously been invisible. I talked with neighbors, youth, parents, listening to their fears and hopes. I understood more clearly that these spaces were delicate ecosystems where social interaction could mean the difference between hope and despair, and that, as a forensic doctor, my role had to go beyond the dead body. I had to involve myself in the very life of those communities. It was then that I understood the power of the social network, not just as an abstract concept, but as a vital web that, if strengthened, could prevent many of those silent deaths. From small gatherings in community squares to pilot projects in health centers, each initiative had the potential to transform reality. The collaboration with the young activists and her team was a decisive step on that path. We shared information, designed strategies, and, above all, had a common goal: to prevent another person from being relegated to the oblivion of the cold room. But despite the progress, the feeling of fragility persisted. I knew I couldn't change everything at once, that the effects of years of neglect would not be easily reversed. Still, every story I collected, every family that felt at least heard, every mental health professional willing to collaborate, were small victories against that invisible and persistent enemy. The personal and collective commitment was beginning to bear fruit, albeit timid and uneven. Finally, this search led me to a reflection I had never had before. Forensic medicine, after all, should not be limited to a mere technical instrument to certify final events. Its purpose could be broader: to become a voice that denounces social failures, that sheds light on the gaps the system does not see or does not want to see, that inspires concrete actions to protect lives in danger. This was the true task imposed on me by that case, the mission born right there, in that cold room marked by silence. And that night, when I closed the door of the room to go out into the street, I looked one last time at the body that had triggered all this change. I felt that, although motionless, that body demanded justice and meaning, a word that transcended its inexorable silence. I understood that now my responsibility was greater than ever. I had to be not only a guardian of scientific truth, but a builder of bridges, a generator of hope amid darkness. because at the intersection of cold and life, I had learned an essential truth. Death is not only the end. It is also, sometimes, the beginning of a necessary struggle to understand, heal, and change what allowed that story to end in silence. And it is in that collective awakening, in that constant commitment, where the true humanity we must protect is found. The cold room was no longer just a place of diagnoses, but the reflection of a world that could change if it learned to listen to what silence had always been trying to tell us.